Okay, the last speaker, Mayor Tory.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to members of Council for a lengthy but I think a very good debate. And I want to begin, as a couple of others have, and just say thank you to our staff. You know, we send them off, and it's not practical, nor do I think it's going to be the right way to do this. I got involved at the very end of this, but I mean, really, it was the staff that did all this back-breaking, incredible, long work to come up with an agreement that I think is a very good deal. And I think that they did it, you know, because it's part of their job, but I think they did it well. And I think this is an agreement that stands the test of scrutiny that has been discussed in here. I should say, obviously, I'm going to be supporting the main recommendation. I will not be supporting and would encourage members not to support motions from Councillor Campbell, Davis, Mamalidi, Matlow, Fillion, and Perks number 1. Perks number 2, I think is I can support. But I think that is because they represent some variation on Trojan horse, a poison pill, a delaying tactic, and so on. And I think we have to move forward. And that brings me to the first question I want to try to answer in my short time, which is, why now? And I think it is because if we don't keep moving forward in incremental steps, and it's incremental steps because we have a stage-gated process here, subject always to the state-gated process, then we are, as I think Councillor Thompson just put it so well, maintaining the status quo. And I wasn't here for all the debates, but there must have been an awful lot of debates where all those projects that are on the $30 billion list were approved here after hours of discussion with no thought given to actually really moving ahead with them, and with certainly no thought given as to how to pay for them. And I think that that is just adding to years of inaction and indecision. That's how Councillor Palacio described it earlier, and he's right. Number 2, because there is an important deadline looming now. It is not made up. Metrolinx are determined to move ahead because they have their own people at Queen's Park saying move ahead with Regional Express Rail. They are having a proposal call to build the stations along that line, and they're doing that very soon. That's why they set the deadline. And they said to us, you can be in which case our stations get to be put into that RFP, and we get to get on with actually the process of getting bids and actually building the stations so people will see the transit getting built. And it isn't a branding exercise. With great respect to Councillor Perks, it's exactly what Councillor Thompson said. It is going to give an opportunity for people at Finch and at Lawrence East and at Liberty Village and at the Unilever site to get on a train inside the city where that train presently whizzes by, and those people will have a chance to get on those trains and use those instead of taking a couple of buses to get over to the Yonge Street subway, which they can't even get on, and avoid the chaos of Yonge and Bloor, which we know is unacceptable. And so we have a chance to be part of that RFP process and actually get on with doing this and being able to say to our constituents, it's really happening, a new transit line, or miss the RFP process, and you know what will happen then. Our stations will be delayed for a long period of time. They will not treat it as a priority, and it will cost a lot more to do it later, because that's always what happens around here. And I think that the people who are going to use these trains inside the City of Toronto, it'll be a new transit line for them, are going to be very grateful indeed that we're moving forward with this so they have a chance of riding on those trains in a shorter period of time than if we didn't. I would say, number 3, a number of the issues in this term sheet that we're asked to approve today have been sitting around for years, and nobody's chosen to deal with them in one way or another. And I think it's time that we did deal with them. You can always debate, you know, exactly how they got dealt with, but it was a negotiation. And again, I think our staff did the best that they could. And I think the final reason is because it's time. It is time to move ahead with this. And with respect to the funding program, I would say I sit here all the time, and I've been here less than 2 years, but I sit here all the time and I hear people all the time saying, I've been here 10 years and 12 years and 20 years and 30 years. And I hope they say that with some pride, because I view politics as a noble calling, obviously. But the fact of the matter is, in all that time, there's been very little done to deal with this now $30 billion list of projects in terms of the funding. And I have said that in 2 weeks I will show leadership, based on a staff report we're going to get, to talk about how we pay for all this. Is the timing of that ideal? No, it's not. But you'll have more of an answer than a lot of the people that have been here for 30 years have offered in all that time. And that's not because people didn't have answers. It's because when the list was put in front of you, and maybe a slightly different list a couple of years ago, everybody voted all of them down. It's just what Councillor Thompson just said. You know, oh yeah, we want the transit, and all our people want the transit, but when it comes to the list, nobody wanted to vote for anything. Well, we have to bring that. Well, okay, you vote. the majority of council didn't vote for one of them. I stand corrected, but you know that's true. And my job this time, I'm not lecturing anybody. I'm just saying it's time we change that practice and go on. May I have 1 minute, Speaker, to finish? Right on. Thank you. May I have 1 minute? Thank you. And so I just say that you know, we could have sent the city manager up to Queen's Park to demand that they pay for the operating funding. Well, they put in their budget this year they weren't going to do that. We have people to go up and demand that my interpretation of the master agreement says they agreed to pay for it years ago. Well, a lot of good that strategy does you with them up there. We know that. We've been demanding for years, we, you, everybody, because we all agreed they should be paying a share of operating subsidy for all of our transit and all the transit in Ontario. And it hasn't worked. So now we've got to move forward, and we've moved forward with a deal that is paying 15 cents on the dollar. I think it's a great deal. It's going to produce transit for people sooner than anything else. It's going to make the biggest difference, the soonest of anything else that we could do. And so I just think we should move ahead with it, and we will continue to answer questions as they go in a stage-gated process, and I think that our staff are to be commended, and I fully support the deal they've come up with here, together with some of the motions that I think will make it better. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. We do have some questions for you. Councillor Perks.
Thank you, Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to make sure I understood. So you said you were endorsing one of my motions and not the other, and I just wanted to be clear. So you're endorsing the motion, I believe, where we make it plain that we're not changing any of our planning. Is that the one you're supporting? That's right. So you're not supporting a motion that if Mississauga gets a better deal on operating and maintenance, that we ask for the same.
What you are asking is that we, in effect, reopen negotiations by doing that, because anything that you sort of say you want to put back to the province, and so we're asking for a vote on this negotiated arrangement, and that's put in front of you for a vote, and you're putting that forward. I obviously support the notion that, and I would certainly be prepared to go to bat in the event we see anybody else. Now, you're going to get into endless discussion about what's an apples-to-apples deal, because nobody else necessarily has the $20 million issue we had, and that's getting 2 stations in return for that. Nobody else has the $95 million overhang from previous negotiations, so we'll get into an endless spin cycle. And I think that we have a term sheet here where everybody's agreed to it in terms of the 2 parties, and we're asking for that to be endorsed or not. And people will vote on that in a few minutes' time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Matlow, you have a question to the Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Mr. Mayor, could you tell us more about the RFP that you mentioned earlier? Because there's no report that discusses this. I think it's important information. When is it going out? How many stations is it for? And how is it that we'd only be contributing or committing $71 million at this point? Would it not be more if we're looking at a number of stations?
Well, the RFP and the $71 million are sort of related but unrelated, Madam Speaker. But the RFP process, and it may be that some of our staff have exact dates, but it was made very clear to us and made very clear to me at the highest levels of the Government of Ontario. They're proceeding like quickly. I would be surprised if it wasn't before the end of the year, but it certainly will be very, very early in the new year, and that's why the deadline was set on November 30th. And my understanding is the RFP they're going to put out is for all of the RER stations inside Toronto, and they could include the SmartTrack stations if we had reached agreement with them by November 30th, or not if we hadn't. And they've made it very clear they actually have 2 sets of documents prepared up there to proceed ahead if we agree, and to proceed ahead with a smaller one that doesn't include our stations if they don't. And so they made that abundantly clear to me. They were not bluffing. They were just saying it's business. We've got to get on with RER, and we're going to get on with that. And if you people aren't ready to say you're with us, then fine. We will not include your stations. And you know what the consequences of that will be in terms of both delay and increased cost.
How long have you known about this RFP?
I've known about it, I don't know, for I would say a couple of months.
Why wasn't this information brought to council?
Well, I've mentioned this before publicly. I mean, I don't know, I don't know why, there's no particular reason why it wasn't. I've mentioned it publicly. It's not a secret.
The reason I ask you, I'm not suggesting you've done anything wrong. It's more, given that deadline, and given the amount of work that's gone into the negotiating process, and given the so many outstanding questions that have not been answered, wouldn't it have been better for staff to come back to us a lot sooner, have a much earlier phase gate, stage gate and allow us to perhaps consider at that time and then provide our feedback to the negotiations, given that certainty of a deadline that you were aware of, rather than, I hope you empathize with many councillors' concerns that at this sort of 11th hour, right before November 30th, we're asked to make a decision that some people have sort of spun in this, you're either moving forward transit or you're not, based on a dearth of with a dearth of information about some of the basic questions that we're asking.
And your question?
Well, I guess your question seems to be predicated through you, Madam Speaker, on the basis that somehow our people took the summer off and didn't negotiate, or, that why have they come at the 11th hour? The negotiations took not only up until, the deadline normally for a submission to be made to the Executive Committee on a timely basis, but actually even beyond that, because they were literally sitting in a room having discussions with the provincial people about trying to reach an agreement, and they eventually did. Well, this was brought here, and we knew the reason the deadline was set was because the province also said, and again they said this to me very clearly, that if the City Council is not going to go along with SmartTrack and is not going to sort of just say, look, we really don't want any part of that, and if that was the majority vote here, I'd have to accept that very reluctantly. We kind of want to know that, because then we've got to get on with our program. They're going to do RER, and so I think that was a very reasonable thing. They set the November 30th deadline, I'll say unilaterally. We weren't consulted on the date, but they said it was a serious deadline, and so it forced us then, whenever they set that back in the spring, to negotiate, and we negotiated the whole time up until now.
If I may, I accept that. It's simply, without knowing the RFP deadline and the extent of the RFP and the number of stations that are going to be tendered, but also, as I asked earlier, and I hope you understand the merit of the question, about the difference between the interpretation that our own city staff, I'm not talking about Metrolinx or anyone else, I'm talking about our own city staff, provided council about whose burden it would be to cover the maintenance and operating costs. When there was a change in that interpretation for whatever reason, shouldn't that information, both pieces and perhaps more, be brought to council? What it feels like, and I hope you understand this, that sort of there's a few people, whether it be you, whether it be Mr. Wallace and others, who were sort of privy to all this substantive, important information, and they were at tables, they were in rooms, but then sort of a need-to-know basis type of information is provided council at the 11th hour. Do you understand how that presents a challenge for those of us who want to make decisions with the information in front of us, rather than happening to hear that there's an RFP or happen to know that A, B, and C is happening?
That was your last question. Okay.
Yeah, I can only say this to you. I obviously wasn't here when all these other words were written, so I can't speak to whether anybody did change their mind or why anybody wrote what they wrote before I was here. I can say that I just read a quote from our city manager saying, as a matter of fact and as a matter of law, the interpretation of the agreement is very, very clear. And I have been here for our city solicitor at present saying that his interpretation is that that is not some sort of enforceable language that you, when I say you, that you and others refer to as being, entitling us to this money. And then the final thing that I know is, since my time here, the province have made it quite clear, including a statement right in their budget applying to Toronto and other cities, they are not providing that funding. So that's the world I have lived in as mayor. That is the world that I live in today. And so the deals we have to do cannot be predicated on what I'll call a fairly romantic, I referred to it earlier on as imaginary, that's not fair. But it's a romantic notion that because there are some words that are admittedly vague in some document from some years ago that may be written by our staff or by them, that we sort of should be up there at Queen's Park saying, I demand you give me a check. And I made the point earlier today, and I'll make this as my final point in answer to your question. I'll make this final point, which is I would have thought in the event the province of Ontario was going to change its policy, because it isn't just the policy for LRTs, it's a big policy principle that we have fought on collectively, me as a private citizen, many of you as councillors, to get them to come back into the operating transit funding game. I would have thought if they were going to make that dramatic breakthrough for Toronto, first of all, they had to do it for everybody, and secondly, they would have been in a pre-election period just before 2014, standing on the rooftops of Queen's Park shouting that as loud as they could. The fact is they didn't do that. They didn't change their policy. There never was, whatever people interpreted, an intention on their part to pay that. They confirmed that in their budget this year, and our staff have confirmed that there was no language we could force them to do it with. So that's why we're where we are.
Thank you.
Plain and simple.
Thank you. Councillor Campbell has